Admiral Joe Sestak, former congressional member from Pennsylvania, commanded an aircraft carrier battle group as an admiral and was on the National Security Council under President Clinton. Joe, good to have you on the Ed Schultz radio show.
Good to be back, Ed. Thanks.
Foreign policy, the topic tonight. All eyes on Gingrich. Do these candidates have anything good to add to what has happened in foreign policy? What do you think we'll see tonight?
Well, I think with the exception of Huntsman, who I believe is in a league of his own, and he's not really a strong contender, obviously, that I'm a bit concerned right now. As individuals, they each have one or two good points. But you brought it up well about Newt Gingrich. He's ready to say, even with great knowledge that he has, what the public would most like to hear. His switch on Libya, for example. I can remember even being in a discussion with him years ago after the weapons of mass destruction were not discovered as they had claimed we would find them during the Bush administration in Iraq. And when he was proffered the question of, what do we say now to the public? The answer was, that's easy. We just have to give them another reason for why we went there. I'm concerned about that. I'm also concerned that the military, for some of them, may be their first resort to addressing a problem overseas, such as Iran. I think any strike, land or sea, from the sea, that we do upon Iran will make the aftermath of Iraq after the initial invasion look like a cakewalk. And I think they failed to see on the whole how much diplomacy can do. This president has worked it well with bringing sanctions successfully, not to the point where we have a complete victory, but it's breaking the back of Iran in its pursuit of nuclear weapons once more.
Joe,
I feel they don't see those types of other instruments of our power.
Do you anticipate there's going to be saber rattling towards the Iranians tonight?
Without a question. They did a bit of that in the last national security debate. I think this time you'll see them coming back to it again, because while the military can never be off the table, it has to be on the back of the table, not the forefront, as I think you'll hear again tonight with that and with other problems we have around the world. And this president, boy, you've got to, as I do as a warrior, commend him upon his willingness to use for the security of America lethal force going against, for example, the two top terrorists we've had against us, al-Awlaki and bin Laden.
Tell me about Huntsman. You made an interesting comment. You think he's got the chops?
In foreign policy, yes, I do. I mean, he said what Mrs. Clinton said 4 or 5 years ago, and this president has just demonstrated with his recent, very strong performance as he went through this swing of his in the Asia-Pacific arena. He said, look, the center of gravity for America in this 21st century is in the Western Pacific with China, economically, diplomatically, security-wise, not as much that it has to do with us having to have a confrontation with China militarily, but how South Korea, Japan, Vietnam are looking at them, and the Philippines as it goes after its resources in the South China Sea. For example, China recently said, Ed, we look at the South China Sea as a core interest. That term core interest is what it used when it speaks about Taiwan, meaning we own it. I think he understands well that that's where the real center of gravity is for America.
There's going to be a tremendous amount of conversation here within the next year with these $1.2 trillion worth of cuts that are going to be made, just how much the Pentagon can take a haircut. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it differs from what Mr. Romney and other of these candidates have said, and including Mr. Panetta. If we were to have this $500 billion trigger be put into effect, that, along with the $350 billion that the Defense Department already is going to cut, will be about 15% decrease over the defense budget of the next 10 years. Yet after the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, when each of those ended, we had about a 30% decrease. Now, it doesn't mean you have to go to 30% because we did hollow our forces out with that amount. But when you step back and see that an aircraft carrier today, Ed, can deliver 8 times in 24 hours the firepower that it could do in 15 years ago, in a sense, one aircraft carrier can do what 8 aircraft carriers used to do. Mr. Panetta saying that we're going to have the smallest Navy, a smaller Air Force, is the wrong metric. It's the capability now present within our aircraft carrier hull, for example, and we're measuring our prowess wrong. Second, Ed, is accountability. Boy, everywhere everybody's asking for accountability in government spending. And yet, just 2 years ago, the Defense Department had $300 billion of cost overruns in its major programs. In fact, Mr. Panetta said it won't be until 2017 till we're able to have an accountability system to follow the dollars that the Defense Department spends in place. In fact, we spent $7 billion as of today trying to put in place one accountability system to replace the 2,000 separate accountability systems that the Defense Department has. So, no, I honestly believe that we have to look at having a much more effective and cost-efficient military by doing things in an accountable way and not measuring our military prowess by how much. And that's why I think the Republicans appear to talk strong without a depth of understanding of what that means to help our warriors have even better capability than just saying, as Mr. Romney says, let's increase to 15 ships we're going to build every year instead of 9.
You know, what you've just told us in the last few minutes, I haven't heard anywhere else, nor that perspective. And, you can't package it in a 15-second soundbite. I mean, it's very thoughtful, and we have to really take a step back and say, okay, what does this 15% reduction mean? And I guess you never fight the next war the way you fought the last one. And staying ahead of the curve in technology is so crucial. How do we do that with cuts?
Well, it's interesting. You've seen that the most important thing in future warfare is knowledge. Where was bin Laden? Boy, once we found him, a quick use of force did it. Let me give another example. China, that Mr. Romney seems to have on his crosshairs. China has about 80 submarines. We've got about 50. The days of one submarine finding another submarine, a needle in a haystack, are over. Imagine, as was once being pursued in the Navy, that we cut our submarines to about 35 and instead develop a Coke can-sized device, sprinkle hundreds of them that are all netted together by little antennas, very inexpensive. We looked at this, actually tried to develop the system till it was stopped. And they have little hydrophones underneath them that can listen when a submarine is trying to stealthily go through the South China Sea. They just all internet one another on their antennas when they pick up the sound, and they have a little old, cheap little unmanned air vehicle fly over and drop a torpedo. Now, I'm not saying we're going to do that with China, but the point is, this type of, people talk about cyberspace security. It's the use of cyberspace, so to speak, able to know where everything is in much less expensive ways rather than building another hull. And that's the kind of depth of understanding that I think you're going to begin to see in defense if we don't have unrequited love, that is, unrequited funding, for every time the Defense Department says, like they did 2 years ago, I'm $300 billion in cost overruns. And nobody wants to say, there's the accountability for that. And that Eisenhower was right. We've got an industrial military. No, he was wrong. It's also a congressional complex of unrequited funding without any accountability. And moving us towards the new type of warfare we need to do in a much more cost-effective way.
Admiral Joe Sestak, former congressman from Pennsylvania, here on the Ed Schultz Radio Show. Always a pleasure. Joe, what are your future plans politically? Are you going to run again?
Well, that's what I'm deciding, Ed. I'm going to take. I just finished my thank yous over the past year, and just put out a massive email to my thousands of supporters to say, next 3 months, my family is going to quietly determine if it is electoral politics, what level, and if not, what are the issues I want to pursue. Because once you're in this debate, if you don't stay in it, Ed, it means you really didn't care about where we are as a nation, because we're at, as you well point out in this discussion we've just had, at a crossroads of whither goes America. So I'm going to stay engaged. I just have to determine if it is electoral politics shortly.
Appreciate your time, Admiral.
Thanks
so
Ed.
much.
Have a great one. Bye-bye.
You bet. You too.